starting at the top of our hour. Let's get our legal extraordinaire up here. Hello, Janae. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning, Holly. How are you?
I mean, we are just up and doing it this morning. What
You are
else
doing
can we
it.
do? What else can we do? Well, I know you have an action-packed segment. So we're going to go ahead and start bringing your folks right on up to the stage. Please let us know if you need anything. Other than that, we can't wait to hear what you got to say.
And we cannot wait to talk to everybody this morning. I cannot tell you how extremely grateful we are for this platform. This was such a brilliant idea. I want to make sure that I shout out and thank Angela Rye and Ashley Allison and Mark Thompson, who's always been such a stalwart in bringing us information. Everyone who put this together in record time, because it shows the power of the people, and that's what we're here to talk about. So we're thrilled to be here. And excellent. I see my colleagues on the screen. Hello, everybody. And Hannah Naomi Jones, how are you?
Good. Good morning, everybody. How are you?
We're all doing good. I can tell by their smiles. And we're waiting for another colleague of ours to join us. But why don't we go ahead and get started? Because I don't know about you, I feel so lifted from that previous panel. And that was just the right way to anchor the morning with just some grounding in where we've been and the inspiration and spiritual constitution it takes to meet this moment. And now we're here to talk about the law and some of the challenges that we're seeing in this Trump administration. So I want to start by saying a little bit about LDF and who we are and why we believe we were built for this, because in quite literal terms, we were. So this is our LDF segment of the State of the People Town Hall Marathon. And we, as I said, are just so excited to participate in this historic digital event. The State of the People is a nonpartisan convening. I want to underscore that. This isn't about politics in the typical sense. It's not about parties. It is about the people. It's about centering critical issues facing the American people, and especially the communities that are experiencing the very, very worst of our government at a time when we should be rallying together. Because we already know the state of our union, right? We know that it is in turmoil. We know it's being tested. We know it's under threat. And the only way to counter that is by focusing on the state of the people. How are we, the people of this daring experiment that we call the United States of America, how are we doing under this administration? And we don't want to hear the spin and the lies and the mis and disinformation that we know is coming later on tonight. We want to answer the question of how we're doing with facts and data and sober reflection. And I'm very glad that everyone who's tuning in has decided to tune into the truth. My name is Janae Nelson. I'm the president and director counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. LDF is the nation's first and foremost law organization fighting for racial justice. Many of you know we were founded by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. Thurgood Marshall, if you don't already know, was a brilliant and extraordinary legal strategist who led LDF for over 2 decades and then went on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice. And here we are now, 85 years later, and LDF is continuing to use the power of law and research and narrative and, importantly, people to protect and advance the full dignity and freedoms of Black people in America. So in this moment, when we are seeing our federal government being intentionally weaponized against our Constitution, against our civil rights, against decades of progress, and especially against Black communities, I can honestly say that at LDF, we were built for this, as are you. Because when we were formed as an organization, Black people were segregated. We were subjected to substandard living conditions in every segment of life by force of law, by the government itself saying that the law required our subjugation. And yet, in the face of all of that, a band of intrepid lawyers saw that colossal power structure those impossible odds, the centuries of inhumanity. And they decided that they could create an organization in the tradition of Black legacy institutions and use the very laws that were made to subjugate Black people and instead use them to help liberate us, to help liberate our country by consequence. So when I say we were built for this moment, I mean that quite literally. We were built to face these moments, and we were built by people like all of us here today who have the same constitution and will and vision and hope and possibility to change this moment from a threat to an opportunity to finally rebuild this country to what it should be, a country where everybody can win. So I am just so proud to be here with my colleagues who are some of the leading experts at LDF who can talk about some of the threats that we are facing. There are so many, so we're not going to be able to cover them all in this hour, but we've chosen some that we're working on and that we think are going to be most important for us to think about as a collective community. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves at the top of their segments because they're each going to take on different topics. And the first one is about Project 2025, which, as we know, is the foundation of this extremist playbook that we're seeing unfold before our eyes. We'll talk specifically about what Project 2025 means for Black communities. We're then going to talk about some of the ways this administration has intentionally targeted Black people, transgender people, and other communities, by suggesting that any focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is illegal. They've even gone so far as to issue a letter to schools across the country threatening their federal funding. So we'll touch on both the campaign to end DEIA and also publicly funded schools. And of course, we've seen the egregious attack on federal workers, a significant number of whom are Black. They're being targeted through mass layoffs and specific targeted firings, as we've seen with some of the top leaders in the administration. So we'll let you know what rights federal workers still have, even in this hostile climate. And there's also a housing crisis that's facing so many of us. And that's in cities and towns and rural areas across the country. It is not limited to any one area. And Representative Crockett just told us how that crisis could be exacerbated by some of the silliness that we're seeing in tariffs and some of the funding crises. So that's just being made worse by the Trump administration's cancellation of a fair housing mandate. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then finally, we can't really close our segment without talking about the state of the people and the power of the people as the most important ingredient to turning these massive, massive threats into an opportunity for systemic and transformative change. So with that, I want to begin and open the floor. I think that Carla McCanders, you are up next. And I don't know if there's other topics that Hannah and other Lolo want to talk about, but let's just jump into it. Why don't you start, Carla, with telling us what is Project 2025 and why does it mean so much disaster for Black people in particular?
Thanks, Danae. Good morning, everyone. I am Carla McCanders, and I direct the Thurgood Marshall Institute. I think everyone is familiar with Project 2025. Now, it is a 900-page policy document, and it's essentially the blueprint for what this administration is doing. All of the executive orders that have been issued since January 20th are looking to Project 2025. So what we did at the Thurgood Marshall Institute was we drafted a report, Attack on Our Power and Dignity, what Project 2025 means for Black communities. And what's important about this report is that it just simplifies what Project 2025 is doing right now through the executive orders. And it takes an abstract concept and make it, digestible. You can pick this document up and you can sit around your kitchen table and read it with your children. And it provides information on how this executive branch is weakening anti-discrimination laws, cutting essential worker protections, undermining Black political power, and most importantly, what the Legal Defense Fund has done and has been central to our mission is ensuring that there's education, quality education for Black students. And Project 2025 is targeting those who are enrolled in school districts without adequate funding, and it's cutting back on funding for individuals who are in colleges. So I want to start out by my colleague Jen Healy, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives. Can you talk to us specifically about the Project 2025 and how it's being implemented by executive orders? And when you use executive orders, will it go into effect immediately? Can you kind of break it down for us in simple terms, please?
Sure. Thank you so much, Carla. And my name is Jen Healy. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Legal Defense Fund. And when Project 2025 was released to the public, it really was a blueprint as to what we should expect from this new administration. And they delivered on that promise. On day one, President Trump issued a whole series of executive orders, and they continued throughout the week. When Carla asked the question, do executive orders become law immediately? I think that the first question is whether or not the executive orders are lawful. And that is what is a major problem with the executive orders that this president has been issuing, because the executive orders is a power that a president has as the chief executive of the United States, but it's limited, right? We have limited government. There is the legislature, which has powers. There's the judicial branch, which the court system, which interprets the laws. But our current president takes on the mantle of being both president and the legislature and the judiciary by trying to rewrite the law, trying to rewrite statutes, and trying to reshape the United States and the federal government beyond the powers of what he is allowed to have. So that's why we've seen a flurry of lawsuits challenging many of the executive orders that President Trump has issued, including a lawsuit that we at LDF filed along with our partners at Lambda Legal on behalf of the National Urban League, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago, challenging the so-called anti-DEIA orders and the anti-gender order that President Trump issued in the early days of his administration. These are just a few examples of the grossly illegal actions that this administration has taken through the vehicle of executive orders. And in terms of, does it immediately go into effect? It really depends on the language of the orders themselves. Some say that they go into effect right away and explain exactly what's going to happen. Others ask for reports or some sort of recommendation from agencies. So we have to wait and see to see what agencies do. But in the meantime, there are lawsuits that are seeking injunctions, preliminary injunctions, which are immediate actions by the court to stop the executive orders from going to effect. And that is certainly what we are trying to do with the executive orders that we are challenging.
Thanks, Jen. I want to kick it over to Trey. Can you talk to us, Trey? We know that these executive orders are consolidating executive power. And given the historical role of the executive branch in both advancing and undermining civil rights at different times in our country, how might this consolidation of power impact Black communities, particularly in terms of civil rights protections? And what are the risks of having the president have so much independent authority in shaping policies that affect and impact racial justice?
Thank you. Yes. And good morning, everyone. First and foremost, of course, naturally. Carla, I think your point is exactly well taken, which is that we are living in scary times right now. This country has a long legacy of racism that is steeped going all the way back to the foundation of this country, but it also has a legacy that shows that when people come together, we're able to make meaningful and substantive change. And that is the hope in this moment, that people will also see the opportunities that we have to reshape and refound this country. I think more specifically to your question around what the dangers that exist inside of the president having such unilateral authority to be able to at will just try to remake the Constitution in his image, or to be able to essentially govern the country through like direct powers from the executive branch as opposed to a representative democracy. We have seen time and time throughout the history of this country that without the effective checks and balances, the pressure is going to be felt most on those that are most marginalized. And so inside of this moment, I think we actually have a unique opportunity to be able to set the tone. You know, I always like to say that the tone is set from oftentimes the top levels. And so the president at this current moment is setting the tone for what he believes this country should look like and should be, right? It may not be representative of what the vast majority of citizens and community members and residents inside of this country believe that the country should be. And so that's dangerous. I think that we expect our elected officials and our public officials to follow the will of the people. And we have seen countless examples going all the way back even to the founding of this country when slavery was the law of the land. And now, you know, in opposition to that, you saw the abolishment of slavery, right, as a core tenet of this country's principles, and then led to the 14th Amendment to establish equal protection under the law. I think all of these are examples of the direction that this country wants to head in, right, where residents want to head in. And so I'll just end by saying that from my vantage point, people are not naive, right? I think that there are many individuals inside of this country who is keenly aware of the dangers of how so much power consolidated in one branch of our government can actually be destructive to long-standing core democratic values that we hold. And one of which is that there's nobody who's above the rule of law, right? That the president is no more or no less critical inside of our society than that of the average voter. And so that to me speaks to who we are as a country, as a democracy. We are still, as many would say, fairly young as a democracy, right? And so there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of growing. And also it's a beautiful experimentation to say that the ultimate power rests in the hands of the people, and that the people get a chance to, by democratically elected principles, be able to decide the direction of this country.
Thanks, Trey. You think you hit the nail right on the head with the democracy is based upon the people. I'm going to pass the baton to Jen Healy to talk about challenging anti-DEI executive orders.
Thank you, Carla. And I already just mentioned briefly about the lawsuit that we are participating in, challenging the recently issued anti-DEI. We call them anti-equity orders because that's what they are. You know, we don't really even know what the president means when he says DEIA. And he's even said in the orders that they can, you know, anything equity related could be DEIA. So I'm going to put a question to this esteemed group because, you know, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, obviously that includes, you know, recognizing the disadvantages and unfair barriers for a host of different communities, you know, different communities of color, women, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities. But there is something just there's a specific harm to Black people through these executive orders that President Trump has issued. There's a certain anti-Black racism going on here. And I was wondering if one of you, maybe, you know, one of you could want, or any of you would want to kind of comment on that. Like, why are these executive orders specifically so perniciously harmful to Black people at this time? And maybe I will give it to Todd.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, these attacks being launched via the attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility are really an attempt to throw us back in time and to lock in the racial injustices that we've been suffering for centuries in this country, particularly as it relates to Black people. Obviously, these orders cut across a wide swath of communities, but if there's a particular attack on Black people because they're attempting whether it's through education and through other Department of Education and other kinds of means, to really entrench the racial stereotypes and race discrimination that we thought we had moved beyond. And in particular on the stereotypes, in some ways by saying we should return to a meritocracy, what they're really saying is that if you as a company or as a government decide that you want to be inclusive, that you want to throw your doors open to everyone, that somehow if you happen to hire a Black person, you've hired someone unqualified. That's a racist stereotype, period. And I think what we are seeing is the attempt to normalize that by simply calling it meritocracy. As an employer, as someone who engages in trying to be inclusive, the only way to ensure you have the most qualified people is to make sure your pool is as diverse and as open as possible. Otherwise, you're going to be relying on hearsay, friendships, all kinds of other relationships that really don't make sure you are tapping the very best of our society.
Thank you so much, Todd. And, one of the things that we've seen is, the opponents to civil rights really taking our words and redefining them and then trying to use them against us. We saw that happening with affirmative action. We saw that happening with critical race theory a few years ago. Now we're seeing this happen with, so-called diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Demetria, can you talk a bit about what's going on here and what we need to do to reclaim our own language and the truth of racial inequalities in this country? Because it does seem like what's happening is the president and his supporters are trying to put forward this false narrative that inequalities don't exist and that any effort to address inequalities is somehow a form of discrimination. And so what should we be doing in order to kind of to really put forth the truthful narrative of what's going on in this country?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about the existence of Black excellence. Black excellence is a thing, right? Black excellence is based on people who deserve and are qualified and are hardworking. So let's continue to push, like this platform today is all about Black excellence, okay? And we've got to know our truth, first of all. That's the first thing. And we've got to be out there and let people see it, let people know it, and not be afraid of it. But at the same time, we've got to hold entities accountable, okay? So there are entities out there who were all about this quote unquote diversity, equity, inclusion not too long ago, right? And all of a sudden they're cowering, right? After there's some election results came out, right? So we've got to hold those folks accountable. It's like, okay, so you were about this at one time, but now suddenly the tide has turned. Nothing's changed, right? People were hired. There was a diverse pool of people hired. There was a diverse pool of people who were recruited, right? And things have been performing quite well. Nothing has changed in our performance. So we've got to hold people accountable. We have to continue showing up with our Black excellence selves and do what we do. So those are two things I would say, Jen, that we've got to do.
Yeah. And I think, Trey, did you want to kind of join in on this conversation about the attack on DEIA?
Definitely. So I think to your question, Jen, around why are we seeing such staunch attacks, there is the recognition that our democracy has changed in terms of demographics, right? That the rising amount of Black people with actual full citizenship and dignity in our country is a concept that scares people across the board, right? And so people do not want to talk about things such as equity. They don't want to talk about things such as diversity. They don't want to talk about things such as equal opportunity, because all of these concepts would level the playing field in a way that it's long overdue. One, like I just thought that, right? In a way that it's long overdue, but also in a way that truly recognizes how much our democracy is changing. I oftentimes subscribe to the philosophy that politics is the expression of economic interest, right? And so we're at a time right now where the question is being called, whose interest is being served? Whose interest is being served by the policies that we're seeing instituted, by rolling back of long-standing policies that did create a more equitable, a more fair, more just society? All of these, I think, are central tenets to who America is and what our democracy wants to be rooted in. But we also are faced with the harsh reality that there are some in our country, in our democracy, who do not want to see that to be the case, who do not want to see fairness, equity, equal opportunity be the law of the land, and that be actually widely spread and enforced. And so there's this attempt to essentially rewrite history, to simply erase some of the most darkest moments of this country in service of saying that, well, we don't need to talk about that anymore because that time period has passed and that there's no residual effects. But the reality of the fact is that it is really a cover to be able to say we're actually afraid of Black people being able to exercise their political power in real meaningful ways, to have candidates of their choice, to be able to fully engage inside of a work economy, such as the one that our country is based off of, to be able to be inside of positions of decision making and be able to actually lead and have qualified candidates who do not represent the typical, status quo, which oftentimes is not Black people, right, in positions of power or in positions of leadership. We still live inside of a day right now where we're saying the first, right? So you look at Tulsa, the first Black mayor, right? We're still saying the first Black something inside of this day and age where this democracy is well over 2 centuries old. And so I think that, to me, that is like the crux of it, is that we are faced with the staunch reality that there are individuals who would rather keep the democracy back inside of the early 19th century, 20th century, as opposed to understanding that the world has evolved and changed. We as a democracy inside of this country has evolved and changed. And that means that we have a responsibility to ensure that we actually address long-standing systematic issues so that the playing field is essentially level. So to me, I think that is the crux of why individuals are flipping, right? They are genuinely afraid of what it means to have, as Demetria said, Black excellence inside of this country.
Well, I'm going to hand it over to Janae because these attacks have affected LDF's work in so many ways. And I know, Janae, you have a lot to say about this moment in terms of these attacks, on whether you call it diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, whether you call it racial equity, racial justice. What does this moment mean to you?
Yeah, I do have a lot to say, but I'm going to try to be as brief as possible because I think the question you asked about why is there such a targeted attack on Black people in particular is such a key one. And it is because there is no greater threat to the myth of white supremacy than Black success and Black excellence. And white supremacy, this idea of it, is just a shortcut because there's not the will and effort to do the work to make this a society that could succeed for everyone. It's much easier to have a powerful minority hoard power, hoard wealth, and try to manipulate the entire system, which is Black people, poor white people, and other marginalized communities, in order to sustain their growth and their control of power. I mean, we've seen that throughout the history of this country, and that is why there is a constant exploitation of Black people. But what we've done is we've resisted this over time. We have turned the laws on their heads. We have evolved this country against its will, and that is something that we need to know is within us, and to know that we already have so many tools that can help do this. So when we talk about what's happening to try to, bleed the workforce out of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, accessibility that has grown over the past several decades, we know that there are protections under Title VII. We know that there are protections under the Rights Act of 1964 writ large that can help us defend against that. And so we need to lean into those protections. Of course, we have headwinds because we don't have a DOJ, a civil rights division that can work with us. And that's why we have to do that work along with our civil rights colleagues, along with state attorneys general that are interested in enforcing these laws on behalf of all the people who are being marginalized. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is a much broader project, that this is intentional. This is by design. And we have to similarly have a counteroffensive that is also well designed. And this platform is just the beginning of something like that for this moment. So Demetria, I know you were going to talk.
I just want to hop in here because I'm so glad you mentioned resource hoarding, because what people now are realizing, and particularly in some rural areas outside of urban areas, is the collateral damage. And so white people who are not rich, who are not powerful, are now the collateral damage of some of the choices that they made against their own interests. So I'm just so glad you mentioned that.
Amen. What about this Dear Colleague letter, though? Let's talk about that. Get to brass tacks.
I mean, we talk about like hoarding, like a small minority hoarding resources. There's no resource more important than educational resources and the pathway to success, to leadership positions, to moving up the ladder when it comes to creating generational wealth. And so, I mean, Demetria, like what maybe get some background about the Dear Colleague letter so that people understand what that is and what this current Department of Education is trying to do.
It's Department of Diseducation, you might want to say. So I was just on a panel Friday, and I was telling people, usually commercially speaking, February 14th is known as Valentine's Day, about love. But actually, what did our Office of Civil Rights and Department of Education do? They sent out a Dear Colleague letter, right? Which is, first of all, let me just say this for the record, is not law. All right. A letter to the public, to educators from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights is not law. Okay. So they sent out this letter threatening people, frightening people, saying that if you're doing anything remotely related to diversity, equity, inclusion, if you're doing things to try to promote diversity, equity, inclusion without overtly stating it, then we're coming after you. We're going to yank your funding. We're going to yank your programs. And that went out all over the country, right? And so that's where we began February 14th, this Valentine's Day hate letter, I would say.
And what they did, in the letter, which is very notable because this is also the strategy that opponents of civil rights used in challenging affirmative action, was trying to use Asian Americans as a wedge among communities of color. First of all, the idea that you're going to lump Asian Americans with white people, as if Asian Americans themselves don't experience some form of discrimination. It may not be the same as other people of color because people are different, but Asian Americans themselves, it's not a monolith. There's like a whole range of diversity when it comes to,
not the model minority, right?
Exactly. And it is deeply offensive to think that Asian Americans do not themselves want racial equity, not only just for Asian Americans, but for other people of color as well. And it's a real threat when and it's such an obvious attempt, right, to create these wedges among people of color, to try to divide us, because they know that, all of us united are a threat to them and are a threat in terms of trying to dismantle the white supremacy that we all are talking about. But it's a tactic they've used in the past. It's a tactic that that they will probably go back to, and it's really kind of perpetuating this, like you said, this model minority myth, as if that Asian Americans do not themselves experience discrimination, but also it plays on a stereotype of Asian Americans, right? We're talking about like the stereotype of Black people, like not being qualified. And then there's also the stereotype of Asian Americans being like hard workers who, make good grades, but are never the leaders in their organizations.
Right? That's
exactly. And all of these are racial stereotypes because none of these attributes are something that's inherent to anyone because of their race, right? There's just, it's really, it's incredibly how offensive this letter is in so many ways.
Yeah, Jen, if I could just jump in for a minute, I think it really points out to why multiracial coalitions, genuine multiracial coalitions, are so important, right? It's from your litigation where you have multiple diverse plaintiffs, but it's also how we, as Trey was referring to, build power among people who are targeted. And as you say, they're trying to divide and conquer us, but we're a multiracial democracy. And if we're going to actually have solutions that are truly reflective of that, we need to all come together and share in the collective dreaming of what that looks like. And that's incredibly frightening to this administration and to their acolytes. And I think they are very, very intentionally, as you point out, trying to draw a wedge between the different groups who they are also oppressing at the same time.
Well, that's exactly why we had to put out the fact sheet that we put out to the public, both to educators as well as to parents, because parents need to know this stuff is going on too, right? They don't need their school to opt out of really programs and initiatives that actually level the playing field. They need to know what their schools are doing and why. And so the fact sheet that we put out to tell the truth, because the letter was just full of lies, disinformation. The interpretations of law were absolutely wrong, right? And so that's why the fact sheet went out to parents, to educators, as well as the letter that we sent actually to the Office of Civil Rights Department of Education, telling them, hey, you need to rescind this, and you need to rescind it now. And so whether they rescind it or not, that is a story to be told, but people need to know the truth.
Well, speaking of truth telling, Todd, I'm hoping that you can come in and talk about what federal workers need to know in this moment, what rights they still possess when they're hearing all of the mis and disinformation that people can just be let go with no consequences, that federal workers are of no value, when we know that we need a strong federal government to help support the programs that help empower people and allow us to live sustainable, healthy lives. And also that Black people have benefited significantly from employment in the government.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And this administration is making drastic, uninformed cuts to the federal workforce, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty, a lot of distress. So yes, we do want to spend some time talking a little bit about what you mentioned, Janae, in terms of who's being impacted, but also what folks can do to protect themselves. So I'm going to start by turning to my good friend Demetria and asking you, why are these attacks so particularly important to Black people?
Todd, there is a huge number of people, Black people, who have benefited from being in the federal workforce. Okay, it's helped people raise themselves and their families from being lower income to middle income, right? It's been transformative, honestly. I mean, you've got about 20% of the federal workforce who are Black members, part of the Black community, right? They live all over the country, not just here in Washington, D.C., not here in the bubble, right? They live all over the country. And so when you attack federal workers, of course, there's collateral damage, like I mentioned earlier, but when you attack federal workers, you are attacking the economic standing of Black communities all over the country.
That's exactly right. I want to pick up on something you said about where these workers are. Can Carla, you talk briefly about who are the federal workers? I mean, there's a stereotype. This administration is full of stereotypes. And one stereotype is that, there's a bunch of bureaucrats sitting in DC, and we need to have them out there amongst the people. But can you tell us a little bit about who the federal workers are?
Yeah, I think that's, the media has focused attention on Washington. However, federal workers are all across the country. They are providing Americans with critical benefits, services, equal access to opportunities, no matter who is in power, no matter who is in the Oval Office. And they are healthcare providers that service our veterans. They're park rangers, they're computer programmers, they're people that work in our courthouses across the country. And so it's more broad than people sitting in Washington, D.C. behind their desks. And what's really important is they're our neighbors and they're our friends. And so we really need to pay attention to what's happening with these dismissals, because it's, going to impact people who are right next door to us.
And one thing I think we're seeing is, I think, Demetria, you sort of alluded to this, that Black people are canaries in the mines. And while, they're targeting Black people this way, it's really flowing out to impacting a whole swath of the communities that we are working in. We have people who once thought that this administration was going to come in and quote unquote fix the federal government, now out of a job. And those aren't just Black people. So I think it's important to understand that Black people in many ways are the first victims of a lot of these attacks. But really, pushes out into communities everywhere. One thing I want to just touch on, and Janae mentioned it as we come to a close, is there are resources, there are things that workers can do. And Jen, can you talk a bit about just briefly what can workers do if they find themselves facing termination or removal?
Well, I think another thing that's coming out from this conversation is that no matter what President Trump wants, he is not a king. He cannot change the law. The law is the same. And for those federal workers who are listening right now, those laws have not changed. And there are federal laws, there are federal regulations, there are federal rules that protect you. And those rules and laws are still in place. And here are 5 that I just want you all to know about. Number 1 is you have the right to be free from discrimination. That is the law. So no one can discriminate against you. The other is that you have the right to free speech. Now it's limited, because you're a federal worker, but you do have rights to free speech with certain limitations. Federal workers have the right to legal protections if you report discrimination or wrongdoing. So, it's not, there's, retaliation is something that you're protected against. You have rights provided by the civil service statutes and regulations. Those rules and statutes are still in place. And then you have the right to make informed decisions. This is, we all understand this is your livelihood. Many federal workers have been in their jobs for decades. These are really life-changing decisions, and you have the right to have the information that you need to make the decision that is best for you and your family. And most important of all, and I cannot stress this enough, President Trump cannot change the laws that exist. He is not a king. He is a president. He has a lot of power, but he doesn't have that much power to be able to change the laws that have been a part of our country for many years. And because that is something that he cannot do. So Todd, I think you wanted to add a few things about federal workers as well before we close this out.
Well, before I do that, I want to just give Trey an opportunity to talk about a couple of things that you alluded to. First of all, your right to speak up, but also the fact that we're not combating a king here, and that we do have opportunities to pull the different levers in our communities, in our government, to make change. But Trey, can you talk a bit about the importance of organizing around this particular issue?
Definitely. And I think Jen actually preluded greatly to this point that I'm about to make, which is that the president is not a king, right? As much as I think that he has probably made something to that effect. We do still live inside of a democracy. In your place of work, actually, you have rights and protections that are long-standing, but also to the extent that the place has become hostile, that the place that you find yourself crushed underneath of the weight of discrimination, or even just like bully bosses, as I like to say, the role of organizing inside of that is more critical now than it ever has been before. I think that's part of the reason why even labor unions in many respects came to fruition as a concept, was to be able to ensure that the average everyday worker had the necessary protections for them to be free of discrimination, to be free of suppression inside of the workforce, the workplace, to make sure that you were not asked to do something unreasonable, right? And that you had the ability to be able to actually set the tone for the type of workplace culture that we all know every worker should be afforded the opportunity to. So I think, Todd, to your point around like right now, this opportunity to organize, the opportunity to organize inside of the workforce, I find this actually can become from a couple of vantage points. One is that there are some unions who are representative of federal workers, right? And so to the extent that you are part of one of those unions, I encourage everybody to reach out and have conversations around what is actually inside of your collective bargaining agreement and what protections you have. But to the extent that you are also not represented by a union, that does not mean that you do not have the same level of protections that the union workers do. It means that you have to also recognize and understand that your voice and your stories carry weight and significant power. You want to be able to use and leverage that. I encourage folks to definitely check out the 5 rights that every federal worker has that Jen Lee so eloquently gave a brief summary of. but we want to make sure that workers are protected. And in this climate right now, building power at the base level, we are seeing it have ripple effects right now. And there's countless moments throughout history where organizing, as I like to say, has gotten the goods, right? Where people have come together and recognized that my story is not isolated. Chances are, if you are being affected negatively inside of the workplace, then somebody else is as well.
That's right.
And the ability for you to tell your story is the only way that you will be able to connect the dots with somebody else. And then what we find right now with this current administration is that thousands of people, especially Black people, who are telling the same story of the targeting of them in their jobs, the narcissism that has been put out there as if they are not qualified to hold these jobs, as if their jobs are meaningless. The federal government, to me, has a duty, a fiduciary and like moral duty, to ensure that the country that we live in is free and safe, and that there are certain powers that are regulated and delegated to government entities to ensure that every citizen and resident and community member inside this country actually is free of racism, is protected at a base and bare standard. So I'll stop there because I know I've been talking a lot, but it is a long way of being able to say that the power that your story has is so critical. And that is what organizing is about. Being able to be like, I have a story that somebody else may also have. And collectively, our stories actually tell a much bigger picture of the issue as opposed to what our opposition or people, unfriendly administrations would like to say or do, which is make it seem like these are isolated events. And we know that they're not isolated events.
Trey, I think your point about organizing is dead on, because just yesterday, Representative Maxine Waters held an event, or let's say people followed her to actually the steps of HUD, right? HUD headquarters. She went there to go deliver a letter to Secretary Turner about all the horrible things going on in HUD, all the firings, all the freezing of funds to contractors unnecessarily and illegally. She wasn't allowed to see them. She wasn't allowed to meet with them. But guess what? Folks met her on the plaza of HUD and talked about their own stories, including a woman who had been fired. And guess what? Her job was to make sure that people who get loans, right, from financial institutions are not scammed. All right. And so we've got a whole cascade of issues that are flowing since January 20th have occurred, right? We've got federal workers who were hurt personally, but these federal workers are there to protect our civil rights. Now, can you imagine? Just imagine, and this is a true story. Imagine you're a homeowner. You're going through the foreclosure process, right? Somebody calls you to try to help you out of that foreclosure process. Next thing you know, you find out that you've signed some paperwork, you've been scammed, and you've given over the ownership of your home to somebody, right? That happened in New York. Not only did it happen in New York, there was a whole community of Caribbean Americans who were targeted, right? People on the phone with Caribbean accents targeted this whole group of people and scammed them out of their homes, right? We already know there's a huge gap between the Black-white home ownership rate. But then you get scammed out of your home. But who did those folks go to? They were able to file a complaint, a fair housing complaint with, guess what, HUD, right? And workers at HUD were able to take up those cases, right? And so we talk about this issue of losing federal workers. Federal workers do critical activity and are important to the whole concept of civil rights. But guess what? They know that. Right? Carla and her folks, we read this in our analysis of Project 2025. We knew this was going to happen. And so they're going by the playbook. These are the kind of harms that are going to happen. We've seen people, it's probably still on their website, I suppose, over at HUD, where low-income women who are renting, probably using Section 8 housing choice vouchers or what have you, are really targeted because they're females and have to subject themselves to sexual harassment to keep their homes, to keep their babies housed. who do they go to? They need to be able to go to HUD. They need to be able to go to a fair housing office to do that. So all of this is just a cascade of horrible things that can happen. But I think, Janae, as you say, we are built for this. We will fight. Somebody asked me yesterday, how you doing? I said, better than Harriet Tubman. Janae, you're on mute.
Yes, so I was saying amen, first of all. So amen, amen. Yes, we are doing much better than Harriet Tubman, and it's our job to make sure that we pass it forward so the next generation will continue to do better. It's not going to die on our watch, I can tell you that. So I wanted to just say a quick word via Carla, who's an expert on birthright citizenship, about some of the work that LDF is doing to challenge what is an attempt to rewrite the 14th Amendment. So we're going to do that in like 3 minutes and then try to close out this session. But this has been great. Go ahead, Carla.
Thank you. Harriet Tubman is sitting right over my shoulder right now and is in here. So LDF joined with the ACLU and filed a lawsuit challenging the executive order to end birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment says all people born in the United States are US citizens. And what this is really about is that citizenship defines membership and belonging in this country. And this is an attempt to enshrine a system of tiered personhood by denying citizenship to those born in the United States. This executive order must be understood in the context of the ongoing fight to ensure racial hierarchies are not replicated in the US through citizenship law from 1790, where we had the first naturalization law that said free white landholding males could only be citizens, to the infamous Dred Scott case where Justice Taney said that the black people have no rights to which the white man is bound to respect. And so it's really important that this is not an abstract concept, that it's targeted at what Trey mentioned earlier, a change in our demographics in the United States. And so I want us to start off going back to Trey. So the 14th Amendment guarantees birthright citizenship to all persons born in the United States. And we continue to see efforts to restrict this right in ways that disproportionately impact Black and Brown immigrants. And so how do incidents like this, the treatment of Haitian migrants, back in September 2021, we saw Customs and Border Protection on their horses whipping Haitian migrants trying to get into the United States. And how does this reflect a broader pattern of racial exclusion? And what does allyship look in this space, Trey, for Black communities and across all communities of color?
Definitely, I know we're running short of time, so I'll focus mostly on the latter part of this, but let me just start by saying that I think the honest reality of the situation is that we are faced right now with people in positions of power and, quite frankly, a minority of our democracy that actually wants to return to draconian old like laws and like cultures and norms that is not truly reflective, right? And so to me, that is the dangers inside of this moment of even something like trying to roll back birthright citizenship. It is trying to define who is a citizen inside of this country from a very small, very narrow perspective, and one that was steeped inside of the founding of white supremacy inside of this country. But to your piece around what does allyship look like inside of this moment, I think one is that we need people to get active and involved. I think traditionally we have a system where we say it is enough to vote when we know that it is not enough to vote, not enough to only vote. Sorry, it is voting is a critical piece of the formula, but our democracy takes work. Because we are a democracy, it means that we will always have to try to safeguard this democracy and precious wins that we have gotten to try to level the playing field. So allyship in this moment looks like our allies being able to join organizations that truly reflect the democratic values that we know that we hold, that we know that the vast majority of people who believe in a free, fair, and just democracy hold. We want folks to be able to join in those organizations, and we need those organizations to join LDF in this fight to protect civil rights, for Black people. Because to me, from a place of strategy, if we are able to target the most marginalized of our communities, it's not trying to play oppression Olympics here, right? Because I don't like to get into who is more marginalized, da 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 da. But from a place of strategy, we know if we target the most marginalized, everybody gets a little bit free, a little bit more just, a little bit more equity, because you are directly targeting the most egregious parts of white supremacy. And so that's what allyship looks like. It is buckling down. It is recognizing that this work is bigger than any one individual idea, any one individual tactic or strategy. I think historically folks compete for power, but that is what this country teaches us, is that power cannot be shared, right? Not teaches us, sorry, let me reframe that. That is what historically people in positions of power who do not truly value a multiracial democracy has tried to teach us, that we have to fight for power, that we have to fight for the scraps, when the reality is that there is enough power to be shared in this country, that everybody can have dignity, and that we can create a country where Black people are thriving, just like, as Demetria said, in the old days, the good old boy days, white people with land, right? Like, it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a both and. Everyone can thrive inside of a society that truly is built on the concept of a multiracial democracy, on fairness, on equity, on equality.
Thanks, Trey. I will kick it back over to Janae. It's very appropriate that we are ending on the 14th Amendment, one of the Reconstruction Amendments.
Absolutely. The 14th Amendment is really the bedrock of our modern multiracial democracy, for this society of freedoms that many of us have taken for granted. And I can just say that, you know, we weren't born during the civil rights movement, but it's time that we develop that muscle. Those black and white photos and videos are not that far away from the history that we are living right now. So we need to conjure that spirit and bring that to this fight. This is our fight today. And we know that nothing is going to change and nothing can be sustained without the power of people, which is why I'm so glad that we're centering people in juxtaposition to what's going to be centered later tonight. We talked a lot about federal overreach today. So I wanted to give folks at least one thing that they can do to combat that. And that is to put in your cell phone the number to the US Senate. The US Senate confirms cabinet members. It gives advice and consent to the president for all of these egregious, unqualified cabinet members that LDF has been opposing. And it's important that they hear from you that you do not support some of these cabinet members, or that you don't support certain laws like the SAVE Act that is attempting to make voting almost impossible for millions of people in this country. So the number to the US Senate is 202-224-3121. It's something that everyone should have in their contacts on speed dial. When something about the federal government is frustrating you, that's who you call, and you let your senator know, because senators are elected statewide. They want as many voters as possible to support them. And so you let them know when you do not agree with what they're doing and hold them accountable. There's also so many important local and state elections that you must engage in to ensure that we are building power at the local and state level. But I really want to thank Trey and Todd and Demetria and Carla and Jen for this incredible discussion. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Sending collective gratitude to all the organizers of this incredible State of the People Town Hall Marathon. Please share the link to this live stream with all of your networks. We want to build the audience throughout the day leading up to midnight tonight, when folks will be giving their response to the other conversation that's happening over there. And please follow LDF on our social channels. Check out our website, naacpldf.org. We have to be so clear-eyed about the threat and the opportunity here. The threat is the irreversible stripping of our rights, which we just cannot stand for. And the opportunity is knowing how to use those efforts of overreach and to undermine and destroy, and instead contrast that chaos with a vision for a future where all people in America can finally win. That is LDF's charge in this moment, to bring that vision to fruition and to fight for the protection of Black people and a thriving multiracial society. And we ask you to join us in that fight. Thank you so much.
Well, let's hear it for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You all did it. Thank you for bringing truth to power. Thank you for reminding us that discrimination is still the law of the land and letting us know that no one is above the law, especially our president. We appreciate you so much. Janae, you did it. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.
All right. Well, listen, we have had a powerhouse conversation with our friends at the Legal Defense Fund, and we are just getting started.